Forget everything the mainstream media is about to tell you about what just happened at Nevatim Airbase in the early hours of this morning. Because what Iran did, and I mean just did, is not simply another missile strike in a long list of escalating exchanges. What happened at 0317 this morning is a technological threshold being crossed in real time. And by the time I'm done walking you through this, you are going to understand exactly why this single strike represents the most significant shift in regional military balance since Israel's nuclear program went operational in the 1960s. The Fattah-3 Hypersonic ballistic missile, Iran's most advanced precision strike weapon currently in active deployment, just cratered the primary runway at Nevatim Airbase. Not a near miss, not a glancing blow that caused repairable damage. Cratered. The runway surface that Israeli F-35I Adir stealth fighters have been using to launch strike missions against Iranian facilities for months is now a moonscape of overlapping impact craters extending across 400 meters of reinforced concrete. And if you think I'm being dramatic, if you think this is just another strike that will be repaired in 48 hours and forgotten by next week, then you fundamentally do not understand what Nevatim represents to Israeli air power and what the Fattah-3 just demonstrated about Iran's ability to hold at risk the most critical nodes of Israel's offensive capability. Let me be absolutely clear about something before we go any further. I spent decades in military intelligence. I've analyzed strikes across multiple theaters of conflict. I've sat in briefing rooms where targeting packages for facilities exactly like Nevatim were being developed. And what Iran executed this morning is not the work of a desperate adversary throwing missiles at a map and hoping something connects. This was deliberate, methodical, and surgically planned targeting logic designed by people who understand exactly what they needed to destroy and exactly why they needed to destroy it now. Nevatim is not just another Israeli airbase. It is the primary operational hub for Israel's F-35I Adir fleet, the fifth-generation stealth fighters that represent Israeli air superiority and the primary platform for deep strike missions into Iranian territory. When you strike Nevatim, you are hitting the operational brain of Israel's strategic strike capability. Iran knew exactly what it was doing. Now let me explain what the Fattah-3 actually is, because the Western press is going to throw this designation around without explaining what it means operationally. And understanding what this weapon system represents is critical to understanding why this morning's strike changes everything. The Fattah-3 is Iran's third-generation hypersonic glide vehicle, publicly unveiled in June 2023 and assessed by Western intelligence agencies as operational since early 2024. It is a two-stage solid-fueled ballistic missile with a maneuvering reentry vehicle capable of speeds exceeding Mach 13 during terminal approach. Let me translate what that means in practical terms. Mach 13 is approximately 16,000 kilometers per hour. At that speed, the time between radar detection and impact is measured in seconds, not minutes. The human decision loop, the time it takes for a radar operator to identify the threat, confirm it's not a false alarm, authorize a defensive response, and actually fire an interceptor, is longer than the flight time of the incoming weapon. You cannot intercept what you cannot react to in time. But speed alone is not what makes the Fattah-3 a paradigm shift. What makes it genuinely revolutionary is the maneuvering reentry vehicle. Traditional ballistic missiles follow predictable parabolic trajectories. Once they're launched, physics dictates where they're going to land. Interceptor systems like Arrow 3 and David's Sling are designed to calculate that trajectory and position an interceptor in the weapon's flight path. The Fattah-3 does not follow a predictable trajectory. During its terminal phase, as it's screaming down toward the target at 13 times the speed of sound, it can execute lateral maneuvers, unpredictable course corrections that make interception not just difficult, but functionally impossible with current defensive architectures. You cannot hit what you cannot predict, and you cannot predict a maneuvering hypersonic glide vehicle in its terminal phase. Having studied Iranian missile technology evolution for years, I can tell you the Fattah-3 represents decades of sustained investment and ruthless prioritization. Iran made a strategic choice 20 years ago that it could not match Israel or the United States in conventional force-on-force military power. So it built something different, a missile force, massive, distributed, hardened in mountain tunnel complexes, and increasingly precise, designed to hold at risk what its adversaries value most. This morning, that strategy proved itself. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because what I'm about to walk you through, the targeting logic behind this strike, and what it reveals about Iranian intelligence penetration of Israeli air operations is something you will not hear explained with this level of precision anywhere else. Iran did not wake up this morning and decide to hit an airbase. The targeting package for Nevatim, the specific aim point on the primary runway, the timing, the choice of the Fattah-3, all of this reflects months of intelligence collection and operational planning. Let me explain what I mean by that. Nevatim has multiple runways. The Fattah-3 struck the primary runway, the one specifically configured for F-35 operations with reinforced surface, arresting gear, and taxiway connections to hardened aircraft shelters. That is not a lucky hit. That is precision targeting based on detailed intelligence about which runway matters most to Israeli air operations. The strike came at 03:17 in the morning. At that exact moment, Nevatim had aircraft on the ground in various stages of preparation for early morning strike missions. Israeli F-35s have been running a pattern of pre-dawn launch windows for deep strike missions into Iranian territory for months. The timing maximizes surprise, minimizes civilian exposure risk, and takes advantage of specific radar coverage gaps that exist during certain atmospheric conditions at dawn. Iran knew that pattern. Iran knew the launch schedule, and Iran timed the Fattah-3 impact to arrive at the precise moment when the maximum number of high-value aircraft were on the ground and the runway they needed to use was operationally critical. That level of targeting detail does not come from satellite imagery alone. That comes from human intelligence, signals intelligence, pattern analysis over sustained observation periods. That comes from an intelligence apparatus that has penetrated Israeli operational security at a level that should be deeply, profoundly alarming to anyone analyzing this conflict. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you about Israel's response options is where this story gets genuinely dangerous. Israel operates under a strategic doctrine that demands overwhelming response to existential level threats. And a hypersonic missile that can penetrate Israeli air defenses and crater the runway at Nevatim absolutely meets that threshold. The Begin Doctrine, named for former Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who ordered the destruction of Iraq's Osirak reactor in 1981, establishes as a foundational principle that Israel will not permit any regional adversary to develop weapon systems capable of posing an existential threat. Iran just demonstrated it possesses exactly such a weapon in combat against one of Israel's most critical installations. The question is not whether Israel responds. The question is the scale and the targets. And those choices carry implications that extend far beyond the Israel-Iran bilateral relationship. At the lower end, targeted strikes against the specific launch infrastructure Iran used. This would be proportionate and contained, the option Washington is strongly urging. But Iran's missile infrastructure is distributed across hundreds of kilometers of mountain tunnels, mobile platforms, and hardened command nodes. You can degrade it. You cannot eliminate it. A degraded Iranian missile force still launches follow-on strikes. At the upper end, strikes against Iranian nuclear infrastructure, oil facilities, IRGC command architecture. Any one of these would represent escalation to a level the region has not seen in decades. Here is what most analysts refuse to discuss publicly. Israel's nuclear doctrine was developed precisely for scenarios where conventional options prove insufficient. The threshold for considering previously unthinkable options gets lower every time the Fattah-3 demonstrates that conventional defenses can be penetrated. That psychological erosion of certainty is more dangerous than any single missile impact. Now let me show you the mathematics that explains why this situation is fundamentally unsustainable. The Fattah-3 that struck Nevatim this morning costs Iran approximately $1.5 to $2 million to produce. That is a conservative estimate based on comparable hypersonic systems and Iran's domestic manufacturing capacity. The Arrow-3 interceptor, Israel's primary defense against high-altitude ballistic threats, costs approximately $3 million per unit. But here is the critical detail that changes everything. Arrow-3 was not designed to intercept maneuvering hypersonic targets. Its success rate against the Fattah-3's specific flight profile is significantly lower than the performance against traditional ballistic missiles. If Israel attempts to intercept a Fattah-3 with Arrow-3, it likely needs to fire multiple interceptors per incoming threat to achieve a reasonable probability of kill. Let's say conservatively, 2 interceptors per target. That's $6 million in defensive expenditure against a $2 million offensive weapon. And that assumes the interception succeeds, which this morning's Cratered Nevatim proves is not guaranteed. Iran can produce Fattah-3 missiles faster and cheaper than Israel can produce Arrow-3 interceptors. Iran has been building its missile production infrastructure for 3 decades. Israel's interceptor production depends on components from the United States and allied nations. Here is the arithmetic that should terrify Israeli defense planners. If Iran launches 10 Fattah-3 missiles in a salvo, and Israel fires 2 Arrow-3 interceptors per incoming threat, that's 20 interceptors expended. At $3 million per interceptor, that's $60 million in a single engagement. Iran's offensive expenditure, $20 million. The cost exchange ratio is 3-to-1 in Iran's favor. This is not sustainable, and every defense planner in Tel Aviv knows it. And here is where we enter genuinely uncharted territory. Layered underneath the Israel-Iran military dynamic is a set of great power dimensions that have the potential to transform a regional war into something categorically more dangerous. Before I continue, if you found this analysis valuable, share this video. Share it because the mainstream media is showing you successful interceptions and strong statements. They're not showing you the mathematics of interceptor depletion, the cost exchange ratios that make sustained missile defense unsustainable, or the intelligence penetration that made this morning's strike possible. Hit that share button and make sure others understand what's actually happening. Now let me explain what I mean by great power dimensions, because this is where the Fattah-3 strike on Nevatim stops being a story about Israel and Iran and becomes a story about the fundamental balance of military power in the 21st century. China has been watching hypersonic weapon development with intense professional interest for over a decade. The DF-17, the DF-21D, China's own hypersonic glide vehicles designed to threaten American carrier strike groups in the Western Pacific, exist within the same doctrinal framework as the Fattah-3. What happened at Nevatim this morning just gave Chinese military planners real-world combat data on hypersonic weapon performance against a Western-aligned defensive system. They are right now updating every war game, every contingency plan regarding American carrier vulnerability in the Taiwan Strait. The lesson Beijing just extracted from Nevatim is that hypersonic maneuvering reentry vehicles can defeat the defensive systems that are supposed to make American power projection unchallengeable. Russia is drawing the same conclusions. Russian hypersonic systems, the Kinzhal, the Zircon, the Avangard, have been touted for years as game-changing weapons. Until this morning, there was uncertainty about combat performance against sophisticated Western-equipped defenses. That question has now been answered. Having served in military intelligence, I understand how these escalation dynamics work. The reality is that once you demonstrate a capability gap of this magnitude, deterrence calculations come under enormous pressure. Israel is now facing a fundamental strategic dilemma. It can respond with overwhelming force, attempting to destroy Iran's missile infrastructure in a massive preemptive campaign. That option carries the risk of igniting a full regional war involving Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, and potentially direct intervention by actors who have been watching this conflict carefully. Or Israel can respond with measured, targeted strikes, accepting that Iran retains the capability to launch follow-on attacks with weapons that Israeli air defenses cannot reliably stop. That option preserves some degree of escalation control, but it also represents a fundamental concession that the era of unchallenged Israeli air superiority in the region has ended. Neither option resolves the underlying strategic problem, and that is precisely the kind of dilemma that leads to catastrophic miscalculation. Here is what else is happening right now. The Israeli Air Force is conducting an emergency reassessment of the entire air defense architecture that was supposed to prevent this strike. Arrow 3, designed to intercept ballistic missiles in their mid-course phase, outside the atmosphere, has demonstrated genuine capability against traditional ballistic missiles following predictable trajectories. Against a maneuvering hypersonic glide vehicle traveling at Mach 13, Arrow 3 is not optimized. The intercept geometry is wrong. The fire control algorithms are wrong. David's Sling, the medium-range system, faces the same fundamental problem. Adapting it to handle hypersonic maneuvering targets is not a software update. It is a fundamental redesign that takes years and costs billions. Israel now faces a reality many warned about, but defense planning underestimated. Offense is outpacing defense in the missile domain. The cost of building an interceptor that can reliably stop hypersonic weapons exceeds the cost of the weapon itself. Iran will be watching, and Iran will be calculating whether this is the moment for follow-on strikes while defensive posture is disrupted. The United States will be attempting to manage both sides, urging Israeli restraint while repositioning military assets to signal resolve. Carrier strike groups, aerial refueling tankers, bomber task forces, all designed to demonstrate that American support for Israel remains absolute, while quietly communicating through back channels that escalation serves no one's strategic interests. But here is what Washington will not tell you. The United States is already overstretched. Ukraine is consuming munitions at rates never contemplated in peacetime production. The Indo-Pacific demands increased naval presence as Taiwan tensions escalate. The Middle East is pulling the United States back into a commitment that could consume military bandwidth for years. The Pentagon knows you cannot be strong everywhere simultaneously. And underneath visible diplomacy, intelligence communities of every major power are dissecting this strike with forensic precision. They are analyzing the Fattah-3's flight profile, the terminal maneuvers, the precision of the impact, the radar signatures, everything that can be extracted from the available data. Because Nevatim is not just a tactical event, it is a strategic inflection point. It is the moment when hypersonic precision strike against a defended target became a demonstrated operational reality. And demonstrated capabilities change the calculations that govern everything from alliance commitments to defense budgets to war planning assumptions. If you stayed with me through this analysis, you understand something that most people scrolling past headlines do not. You understand that this morning's strike was not random. It was not impulsive. It was the product of years of planning, intelligence collection, technological development, and strategic patience. And it represents a shift in the regional balance of power that cannot be reversed with a press conference or a carrier group photo opportunity. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because this is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of a new chapter in Middle Eastern military dynamics. The runway at Nevatim is cratered. The F-35s are grounded. The hypersonic era has arrived. And the world that existed before 317 this morning, the world where Israeli air superiority was unquestioned and Iranian missile threats could be managed through layered defense, that world no longer exists. What comes next depends entirely on whether the people making decisions in the next 72 hours understand that reality, or whether they continue operating under assumptions that a hypersonic missile just rendered obsolete. The clock is running. Subscribe, share, pay attention, because history is being written in real time, and understanding what's actually happening operationally, mathematically, strategically is not optional anymore.